From the ages of 9 to 14, my dad lived in a house that he was renting at the time. It was the countryside, and I would go over there every other week. I would alternate between my mom's and dad's every week. Well, at the time of this story, I was staying at my dad's. It had to have been a Friday or Saturday, because I had a friend next door that I would sometimes get to hang out with and stay the night at his place. He was usually only there on the weekends, and it was his grandparents' house. It was awesome when he was there because growing up, he was the only other kid in the area. He was like 3 years older than me as well, so it felt cool to hang out with someone that was bigger and cooler than me. We did all kinds of things there. They had four-wheelers that we could ride and a pond that we could fish in. Or we would play catch with a football. I mean, it was endless. We always had something fun to do. Usually when I would stay over there, I would sleep on the couch in the living room, and my friend Benny would sleep in his room. Technically, it was the guest's room, but he had all of his stuff in there, and no one else really ever slept over. Everyone went off to bed, but I wasn't super tired yet. I didn't have a phone at the time, but I did have an iPod. Benny's grandparents didn't have Wi-Fi though, so I could only play the games that I had that didn't require internet. When I got bored of that, I flipped through the channels on the TV and saw that America's Funniest Home Videos show was on. And it was on for the next 2 hours. That was one of my favorite shows as a kid, so I was certainly happy about that. While I was sitting there watching TV, a commercial came on. Usually when that happened, I would mute the TV until my show came back on. And I would play on my iPod in the meantime. Everyone had been asleep in their rooms for around an hour or so, and I thought I heard something slightly weird, unnatural. Sometimes old homes might make noises, but this was coming from outside. It wasn't the trees scraping against the siding or the window, and I knew this because that sounded completely different than this. I paused and focused on the sound, bringing my rapid breathing to a slight halt. There was 100% someone outside creeping around the premises. Every single light was off inside the house, as well as outside. There were no cars in the driveway either. His grandparents liked to keep them in the garage. I knew it was a person because for one, I heard multiple footsteps more than once in a span of 5 minutes. And the second time he came back around on the front porch, I saw the shadow of a man trying to look inside the blinds. I wondered who he was and what he might have wanted. My friend's grandpa has told me that their house has been broken into twice in the last 30 years. But after setting up security cameras and alarm system, that seemed to keep the weirdos at bay. Until now, at least. I know I should have woken somebody up for help, but for some reason, I had more guts to do something else. With the only idea that came to mind, I got up and turned the front porch light on, and I began banging on the front door. Just enough to scare the shit out of the man, but not wake up anyone in the household. I think I might have scared that weirdo more than he might have scared me, because he ran like hell right then and there. All jokes aside, I was still pretty scared, but I had to do something. Looking back to the story, it's kind of funny to tell because I was only 10 years old or so, and I managed to do that. Not trying to pretend like I was tough though, because I wasn't. I had some balls for my age, you have to admit though. I'm not going to pretend like I didn't stay up all night, hoping he wouldn't come back. I never told my friend or his grandparents about what happened. I know I probably should have, and I really don't know why I didn't. I was probably more worried about being in trouble for something. Sometimes kids make dumb decisions. I think we are all aware of that. From what I remember, it was a weekend and I was supposed to spend it at my friend's house. For 11-year-old me, this was an exciting time, having been loaded with schoolwork the entire week. I was to spend what I believed to be Friday night sleeping over and spend the entirety of Saturday at her bungalow and return home that very evening. What made it even better was the fact that her parents had an event that they could not avoid and therefore trusted us to stay alone in their 2-floor house for the entirety of the 6 hours they were gone. Back then, the idea of spending the whole night alone with my friend was great. No interference of parents, and a whole 6 hours of games and movies on their huge TV. As it turns out, my friend had other ideas. I arrived at her house just shortly after 8 p.m. It was already pretty dark out, and her parents had waited for me to arrive before telling us about their emergency contacts, dinner, and such. They also reminded us to get their 4-year-old Labrador inside, as the weather was acting up and his kennel had a few loose panels, which leaked when it rained. After they left, we watched a few cartoons and had dinner, and we were chilling in her living room playing cards. That's when my friend Sid had the ingenious idea of exploring a fenced plot of land a few hundred meters down the street that she resided on. We got the dog inside, leashed it to its chain that allowed it to roam within reason, got the keys, and left the house to make the short 10-minute trip. At this point, it was about 10 p.m. In retrospect, this is where we still had a chance to avoid this particular encounter, but being the curious and daring 11-year-olds that we were, we ventured anyway. We arrived and set to climbing over the 2-meter wall. Luckily for us, the wall was broken enough in places to make good holds to carry us over. Once inside and over the wall, Sid suggested that we stand a few meters away from each other and continue walking for as long as we could, till one of us was too scared to keep going. So we faced each other and walked backwards until there was just enough light to see the general silhouette of each other. After what seemed to be a good minute, I saw Sid's hunched form rise and start to walk towards me. She seemed to be walking rather fast and a haphazard manner, jumping over rocks and such at a daring pace, even getting cut by some thorns in the process. She came up to me, and just as I was about to laugh and call her out on being scared, she told me that we needed to leave because she needed to go feed Shaggy. I remember being really confused because her parents had already filled his bowl with food, and he had this water thing which he could operate in case he was thirsty. But I saw her face, and let me just say, I have never ever seen her this pale. She looked like she had seen something terrible. So without asking questions, I said okay, and we made our way back over the wall, albeit in a tense manner and rather quickly. The moment my feet touched the ground, I felt Sid grab my arm and straight up just start sprinting with me down the street. To put things in perspective, I had a bruise from the way she grasped it for 2 weeks straight. So we definitely ran like hell. We arrived at her house and went in through her front yard fence gate. At this point, I was starting to panic, but we got into the house, and Sid then proceeded to run around the whole entire house, locking and closing all the possible windows and doors, as well as pulling the curtains shut. I was very confused as to why she was doing this, and so was her dog, who stood there and followed her around while she did. After about 10 minutes, she came back into the ground floor living room, and with a very scared expression, she explained to me that the reason she did all that was because while we were sitting apart, she happened to glance away a few meters to my right to see another human silhouette crouching in the bushes. She thought she was imagining it until she moved closer to where I was sitting. She didn't want to startle me or the person, so she made up having to feed her dog as an excuse to get out of there without alerting the person still crouching there. After hearing this, I was quite shaken and we hugged for a few minutes, deciding to not tell her parents as they very much had warned us to not go out of her compound. We did not want this to be the last of our time alone together, having this much fun, so we peeked out the window into the street, which seemed to be empty as far as we could see so far, and we proceeded to put it behind us as excitement took over our minds once again. I would have loved to say that this was the end of it, but what happened next has stuck with me to this day. To give you an idea of the layout of her compound, her house was surrounded on 2 sides by a lawn, and the lawn was then surrounded by a fence, maybe 2 meters high. The house itself had windows all around the perimeter, as well as 2 potential entrances. The first being the front door, while the second being a door to this small attached space next to the house, which was made of see-through metal, like the kind which metal fences are made out of, but stronger. This space had a metal door with a lock only accessible from the inside. However, this door only had a deadbolt on it, and it was made of light wood. This is also of importance. So an hour or so in after the incident, we were upstairs in her air-conditioned room playing games on her computer and talking about whatever it is 11-year-olds talk about, when suddenly we heard the dog bark downstairs. It was growling and it seemed to bark at random intervals. Keep in mind that her dog was a friendly Labrador who rarely ever growled or barked aggressively, especially. My friend went to get the dog upstairs to her room, and after she returned, she informed me that the dog was standing near the front door, growling at it, and that it took her quite a bit of effort to get him upstairs, as he kept trying to go back. We were really confused, as this was absolutely weird for him to do, and thinking that a stray dog may have caught his attention, we decided to go into the balcony attached to her room that gave us a view onto the front lawn and a part of the street directly in front of the house. Instead of seeing what we assumed would be a stray dog or cat, we looked down to see a person standing very still on her lawn and in front of her front door. In the limited light that we had, we could make out heavy layers of muddy-looking clothing and a head full of hair that looked very matted. The dog was with us in the balcony and was wanting to be let outside. We crouched in our balcony, and right as we were about to discuss what we should do, we heard what sounded like the front door rattling, as if someone was trying to open it with a handle. We creeped back downstairs, only to realize that this person had now moved onto the window next to the door and was trying to open that now. The realization hit that he was trying to find an entrance into the house by going around the perimeter. Just as we were about to creep back upstairs, my friend grabbed me again and, in a hushed tone, told me that she had forgotten to lock the attached space door in her hurry before. We both looked at each other with fear as we realized that it would gain the intruder easy access into the house. At this point, we heard the windows rattling behind the house. The attached space door was a few meters away from the front door, and we were lucky that he had chosen to go around the other side. She told me to wait by the inner door with the dog, while she went outside and bolted the metal door. She informed me to close the door as soon as she returned, and that if she was caught, to let the dog outside and to close the inner door as discreetly as possible to not give myself away. We were both terrified, and since we had no time to argue about it, I stood guard at the inner door while she went to the outer door and fumbled with the lock, and then returned inside, practically running as quietly as she could. We closed the inner door, and just then we heard the outer door rattle harshly. Had she not gotten there then and there was a big chance that we would have had no choice but to hide in the house somewhere. After he tried opening all the doors and windows, which took a while, as he was doing it quite intently and forcefully, we found our way back upstairs and went back into her balcony to see if he had gone away. As we looked down, we saw him once again standing in her front lawn. However, this time, we could see his head was tilted back, and it felt like he was looking right at us. However, we knew that it was far too dark for him to see. He then started giggling in the quiet of the night and proceeded to go down on all fours, crawling around the lawn in front of the house while his laughter grew. In retrospect, we should have called the authorities at this point, but being the terrified 11-year-olds we were, we did not want to get into trouble for not being able to follow simple instructions. He did this for nearly a half an hour on and off, only to stand up once again, facing the street, and then climbing on top of the kennel in the corner, up onto the top of the fence and jumping down. We stayed on her balcony waiting to see if he would return, but over an hour or so passed where he didn't, and that was the last we saw of him for the entirety of the night. Till around 2 a.m., her parents returned. The next morning, they were very confused as to why all the doors and windows were closed on such a pleasant night, and why there was mud on the front doorknob. We said we just wanted to play in the dark inside the house, lying about the actuality of the situation, and to this day, I do not think the man has been caught. Okay folks, so this happened when I was 14. I'm 29 at the time of writing this. I remember this story from time to time, meaning like once or twice every few years. It still gets me in a weird mood for some reason. Anyways, I was walking with one of my friends in the city the other day. I tried holding her hand, but then she thought I just bumped into her and apologized, so I was able to recover smoothly. Then I saw a group of kids skateboard past us, and lo and behold, that was the first thing that sparked this memory, so I figured I'd write it down. so I'm not going to use this kid's real name, so I'll just call him Vinny. I come from a town where the people you went to school with in kindergarten were the same kids you graduated with. Vinny moved to our school about halfway through the year. When new kids came to our school, everybody seemed to flock to them. At 14, I was kind of a dork, but also kind of a douche, which made me surprisingly likable to most people. Vinny would always sit by himself during lunch. Something I found amusing about him was that he would get infuriated if people asked him if he skated. I took that as a challenge to try and piss him off, and it worked. The first time he and I had class together, I remember the teacher asking him if he had his books yet. He responded with, "My wife never confirmed my school schedule with the front office." I remember everyone thought that was hilarious, because he was 14 years old and he had a wife. He was clearly trying to get one over on the teacher. My friends and I were skating after school, and we saw Vinny one day. I remember talking to my friends about what he said, and we all became oddly infatuated with this kid. It took some doing, but after about a week of letting him hang out with us, he became one of the boys. One of my buddies asked if we could sleep at his house on Friday night, under the guise that we would all take turns staying at each other's houses, to skate, play video games, and smoke the green stuff. He looked perturbed, which is something I wish mattered to me back then, but the next day at school, he did say it was okay after asking his parents. My buddies and I rode our bikes to where he lived, with clothes for the night, and our skateboards strapped to our bags. We met his family, who at face value seemed completely fine. Then things got a little bit weird. First, his dad had a huge weapons collection. At the time, I think we all thought it was awesome, but he even took us out into a field by a canal to shoot some of his assault rifles. I know this wasn't really cool of him without asking our parents' consent. Next, we met Vinny's wife. Yes, the woman was real. She was also 26. While we lived deep in the southern US, even this was taboo. They would like to hold hands and stuff. At the time, I guess we kind of thought it was cool, even though it was strange. It was like dating a senior when you're a freshman, only he was in high school and she paid taxes. Things kind of got to a new level of weird when Vinny's dad had his arm around Vinny's mom, and his other arm around a girl that couldn't have been terribly older than we were at the time. Apparently that was also his wife. We then spent about 2 hours praying with the family in the living room. I was raised Catholic, but couldn't determine which religion they were practicing. Once we finished with that, we went outside to start skateboarding. After a few minutes, his dad came outside and ordered us into the house. Vinny's mother then had us stand in line outside of the bathroom to take a bath. It still skeeves me out, but I remember we weren't allowed to drain the water from the tub. I was the last one to bathe. Also, all of the mirrors in the house were covered with sheets. I don't know the significance of this, but it makes more sense to me to not have mirrors at that point. We were told to go to bed after this, even though the sun wasn't even going down yet. Vinny went to bed with his wife. The three of us that remained just laid there in one single queen-sized bed and talked about how much fun we weren't having. The final straw for the night was having to hear Vinny's parents, and maybe the other woman, doing the dirty in the next room. It was almost 11 p.m. when we were fed up and decided to just get on our bikes and leave. It was dark and we had to ride through some bad neighborhoods, but we made it safely to my other buddy's house. Vinny's mother would also later call all of our parents and leave some cryptic messages, which implied trouble. Vinny was pulled from school about a week or so later and we never saw him again. I don't know what that family was into. Maybe it wasn't creepy at all and I just don't understand. All I know is that we felt uncomfortable there. I have no issues with religion whatsoever, but if this was part of their practice, I think it's a little weird. Out of curiosity, I went to find Vinny on Facebook. All I can confirm is that he, his mother, father, and one of his sisters had died. There were no public records of what happened to them, or if they even died at the same time. Probably not the creepiest story out there, but it's one I still come back to. It's worth to tell as it's an interesting memory.